The shovel bit into the earth with a dull thud, a sound swallowed by the vast silence of the valley. Elias drove it down again, his boots grinding against the metal, his shoulders taking the strain. The soil was a stubborn mix of clay and stone, chilled by the coming autumn. Beside the growing rectangular pit, an old dog with fur the color of dried bracken watched with intelligent, patient eyes. Boro. He had been Elias's father's dog, and his father's father's before that, or so it seemed. The dog whined softly, a low note of concern in the crisp air, as Elias paused to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty glove. The pit was already 4 feet deep, 12 feet wide, and 20 feet long. It was the beginning. His grandfather's journal lay open on a flat rock, its leather cover cracked, and its pages yellowed and stained with the ghosts of long dead hands. The ink was faded, the handwriting a tight, precise script filled with drawings of mortise and tenon joints, strange angles, and cross-sections of walls packed with moss and wool. One drawing dominated the page, a house of 3 distinct tiers, stacked like uneven boxes, the lowest of which was half buried in the earth. A folly. That was the word he'd heard whispered in the settlement down the valley. Old Man Hemlock had been the first to stop by. He leaned on his walking stick, his face a road map of hard winters, and squinted at the hole in the ground. "Digging a root cellar, boy?" Elias shook his head, not looking up from his work. "A foundation." "Foundation for what? A tomb?" Hemlock chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "That deep, the frost heave will crack your walls by January. The ground here has a memory, and it's a cold one." Elias drove the shovel in again. He felt the man's stare on his back. "I have a plan." "A plan," Hemlock repeated, the word tasting of disbelief. He gestured with his stick toward the neat stacks of felled pine and oak Elias had spent the last month cutting and peeling. "You've got enough timber there for 2 proper cabins. Don't waste it on a fool's notion. Build low and tight, like your father did, like we all do. That's how you survive a winter here." He waited for a response that didn't come. Finally, he shook his head and shuffled away, his parting words drifting back on the wind. "Wait until winter." The phrase became a refrain in the valley. A week later, Mr. Sterling rode by on his big gray mare, the wealthiest man in the county, owner of the mill and most of the land Elias's family had once tenanted. He reined in his horse, looking down from his saddle with an air of proprietary concern. He saw the deepening pit, the stone Elias was now hauling from the creek bed on a crude sledge, and the journal. "Elias," he said, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "I respected your father. He was a practical man. This is not practical. What is it you think you're building?" Elias placed another stone onto the sledge. It was heavy, its edges sharp against his palms. "A house. It looks more like a misplaced watchtower. 3 levels, I hear? In this valley? The wind will peel it open like a piece of fruit. You'll be heating the sky, son, wasting good timber that could build a solid, sensible home." Mr. Sterling's gaze was dismissive. "It's a shame, all that effort for nothing." Elias didn't argue. He didn't explain the principles of thermal stratification sketched out in his grandfather's journal, the notes on how warm air was a restless thing, always seeking to escape upwards, and how a house could be designed not to fight that restlessness, but to use it. He didn't speak of the deep stone foundation acting as a thermal battery, absorbing the Earth's deep, stable temperature. He just wrapped the rope around his hands and began to pull the sledge. The weight was immense. His boots slipped in the mud. Burro trotted alongside, nudging his hand with a wet nose, a silent offering of support. Mr. Sterling watched for a moment longer, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, in his eyes, before he clicked his tongue and rode on. Even Mrs. Gable, who had brought him a stew and a loaf of bread after his parents' passing, wrung her hands when she saw the first course of stone being laid. "Oh, Elias, it's so big and so tall. A good house hugs the ground. It borrows its warmth. This is reaching for the cold. You'll freeze in that folly, child. You surely will." "It'll be warm," Elias said quietly, fitting a stone into place. He checked it with a level his father had left him, tapping it gently with a mallet until the bubble floated perfectly in the center. "How?" she asked, genuinely wanting to understand. He couldn't give her the words. The knowledge was in his hands, in the diagrams. It was a feeling, a deep certainty inherited along with the journal. He just looked at her and said, "It's in the design." She left the stew, patted his arm, and walked away with a worried frown. By the time the first snow flurries dusted the valley, the stone walls of the first level were 5 feet high, 4 of them below the grade of the earth. He had built it with a 2-foot-wide cavity, which he was now painstakingly filling with dried moss, sheep's wool he'd traded for, and tightly packed earth. It was slow, brutal work. His hands were a mass of calluses and cuts, the muscles in his back and shoulders a permanent burning ache. Every night he would collapse onto his cot in the old, drafty shed he was living in, Burro curled at his feet, and study the journal by candlelight. He would trace the drawings with a finger, memorizing the next steps. The floor joists for the second level, the angle of the notches, the placement of the central chimney flue, which was to be the heart of the entire structure. One afternoon, as he was wrestling a heavy beam into place, a new visitor appeared. It was a young woman named Lena, her hair the color of autumn leaves. She didn't offer advice or warnings. She just stood for a while, watching him work. Burro, who was usually wary of strangers, trotted over and rested his head against her hand. "That's a deep notch," she said, her voice clear and calm. Elias looked at the log he was carving. "It has to be. 3 inches. For the crossbeam." "My father says you're wasting your time," she said, without judgment. She was Hemlock's daughter. "He says the wind will find every seam." Elias grunted as he heaved the beam, sliding it into the notches he'd cut in the top of the stone walls. It fit perfectly, a seamless join. He stood back, breathing heavily, and looked at his work. "The seams will be tight." She watched him for a long time, her head tilted. "Can I help?" she asked. "I can bring you water, or pack insulation. My hands are smaller than yours. I could fit them in the tight spaces." Elias looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not pity, but genuine curiosity in her eyes, a flicker of something else, too. Respect, maybe. He gave a short, sharp nod. "The moss needs to be packed tight, no air gaps." From that day on, she came most afternoons. She didn't talk much, and neither did he. They worked. She would hand him tools, help him mix the clay and straw chinking for the log walls of the second story, and use a small stick to pack the wool insulation into every tiny crevice. Her presence was a quiet comfort, a silent counterpoint to the chorus of doubt from the valley. She never questioned the design. She just watched it grow, her gaze thoughtful. The second tier rose through the shortening days of autumn. It was a traditional log cabin structure, but it sat entirely on top of the stone-walled first level, its floor a good foot above the surrounding ground. This was the main living space, with a small footprint, just 16 by 20 feet. He built the fireplace and chimney from creek stone, a massive solid column of rock running up the center of the structure. The construction was meticulous. Each log was scribed and coped to fit the contours of the one below it, the chinking thick and solid. Hemlock walked by again, saw the progress, and just shook his head. It's a chimney with a shed built around it. Wait until the first real storm. The third tier was the strangest of all. It wasn't a full story, but a smaller, 10 by 12-foot room perched on top of the main cabin, like a captain's lookout. Its walls were thinner, and the south-facing side was designed for large windows he had yet to acquire. It looked precarious, top-heavy, and utterly indefensible against the valley's notorious winds. This, the journal explained, was the solfångare, the sun catcher, the heat trap. The warm, stale air from the living space below, along with the immense radiant heat from the stone chimney running through its core, would collect here. This captured warmth would form the final, most important layer of insulation for the living space below it. The air itself was a blanket. As the first deep snows began to fall, he worked on the roof. It was a simple pitch design, but he laid down 3 layers of materials. Thick oak planks, followed by overlapping sheets of birch bark he'd spent weeks carefully peeling and flattening, and finally a top layer of sod, cut from the meadow in thick, grassy squares. The weight of it was enormous, pressing down, sealing the structure, making it one with the earth it grew from. The day he finally finished, the sky was a sheet of iron gray. A bitter wind swept down from the high peaks, carrying the promise of a long, hard winter. The cabin stood complete, a strange, 3-tiered silhouette against the snow-covered landscape. It looked proud, stubborn, and utterly out of place. Boros sat at the threshold of the newly hung door, his tail giving a slow, steady thump against the wood. Elias stood beside him, his body a symphony of aches, his hands raw, but his heart quiet. He had done it. He had followed the plan. Now, all that was left was the waiting for winter to pass its judgment. He spent the first month of winter settling in. The ground floor, the cellar, was intensely cold, just as the journal predicted. It was a perfect cold sink, drawing the chill from the earth and holding it. The temperature down there hovered a few degrees above freezing, ideal for storing the potatoes, apples, and cured meats he had prepared. The second floor, the living space, was a revelation. With a small, steady fire in the hearth, the room was not just habitable, it was comfortable. The thick, insulated walls held the warmth, and the massive stone chimney radiated a gentle, pervasive heat long after the fire had been banked for the night. He placed a thermometer on the wall. Outside, the temperature dropped to 10 below zero. Inside, by the hearth, it was a steady 65 degrees. He checked the third floor, the attic space. He had managed to trade for 2 large panes of glass for the south-facing wall, a huge expense, but a crucial one. He climbed the steep ladder he'd built. The air in the small room was noticeably warmer. The sun, though weak, streamed through the glass, and the stone of the chimney was hot to the touch. The thermometer he hung from a rafter read a startling 78 degrees, a pocket of summer trapped at the top of his house. The heat radiated downwards, a warm cap on the living space. The design worked. It was exactly as the drawings had described. Lena came to see it. She brought a jar of honey and a small knitted scarf for him. She stepped inside, her eyes wide. She held her hands out, feeling the air. "It's warm," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "It's warmer than our cabin, and my father keeps the fire roaring all day." Elias nodded, a small, proud smile touching his lips for the first time in months. "The heat stays." She climbed the ladder to the third tier and gasped. "It's like a different season up here." She looked at him, her expression one of profound understanding. "They were all wrong." "I had a good plan," he said simply. The valley, however, remained unconvinced. The winter was a mild one at first, with manageable snows and only a few nights of deep cold. The smoke curling from Elias's strange, tall chimney was a regular sight, but the consensus remained firm. "A mild winter proves nothing," Hemlock was heard to say at the general store. "It's a fool's luck. Wait for the blizzard. Wait for the wind that scours the bones of the earth. That house will be a tomb of ice." Mr. Sterling simply referred to it as the boy's folly, a landmark of youthful arrogance. Elias paid them no mind. He spent his days chopping wood, stacking it in the sheltered space beneath the second floor's overhang, checking his stores, and reinforcing the sod roof. He and Boro would take long walks through the silent, snow-filled woods, the dog's paws making soft prints beside his own. He felt a deep sense of peace. The house was not just a shelter. It was a living thing, breathing warmth, a testament to the quiet wisdom in the faded pages of the journal. He had honored his grandfather. He had built a home. Then, in the second week of January, the sky began to change. The usual gray deepened into a bruised purple. The air grew unnaturally still and heavy, and the cold sharpened, biting at any exposed skin with a new ferocity. Boro became restless, whining low in his throat and pacing from the door to the window, his ears flat against his head. The animals knew. Elias had seen the deer moving down from the high slopes in unusual numbers, seeking the thickest groves of pine for shelter. He went outside and stood on the small porch he had built. There was no wind, but the silence was menacing, an indrawn breath. He looked at the sky. He had seen a sky like this only once before, in a story from his grandfather's journal. The 100-Year Blizzard, it was called. He spent the rest of the day making final preparations. He brought in enough firewood to last 2 weeks, stacking it high against the interior wall. He checked the seals on the door and the 2 small windows of the living space, packing them with extra strips of wool. He filled every container he had with fresh water from the well, knowing it would soon be buried and frozen. He brought Boro's bed inside and placed it close to the hearth. The dog immediately curled into it, still trembling slightly. The first flakes of snow began to fall as dusk settled. Not the gentle, drifting flakes of a normal snowfall, but small, hard pellets, like grains of sand, driven by a rising wind. By nightfall, the world outside had vanished. The wind shrieked, a physical presence that slammed against the cabin walls. It was not a steady blow, but a series of violent, unpredictable gusts that clawed at the roof and sought any weakness, any tiny crack. Elias could hear the trees in the forest groaning, the sound of branches snapping like gunshots. But inside, the cabin was solid. The low profile of the stone base, half buried in the earth, gave the wind little to purchase. The upper tiers, though they took the full force of the gale, were anchored to the immense weight below them. The house shuddered, it groaned, but it held. It held. He kept the fire small and steady, conserving wood. The temperature inside remained stable, 64 degrees. He sat in his chair, the journal on his lap, and listened to the storm's fury. Boro lay with his head on Elias's foot. His trembling finally subsided, replaced by a deep, trusting sleep. For 2 days the storm raged without pause. The snow piled up in monumental drifts, burying the first level of the cabin completely. From his second-story window, all Elias could see was a churning wall of white. The world had been reduced to the 4 warm walls of his home. On the morning of the 3rd day, there was a new sound, a frantic pounding that was nearly lost in the howl of the wind. Elias went to the door, Boro at his heels, barking furiously. He had to put his shoulder into the door to open it against the pressure of the wind and the drift of snow that had piled against it. When he finally forced it open a crack, a figure stumbled in, covered head to toe in ice and snow, collapsing onto the floor. It was Old Man Hemlock. His face was blue with cold, his beard a solid mass of ice. "The roof," he gasped, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "The wind took the roof clean off." Elias dragged him inside and slammed the door shut. He stripped off the man's frozen outer layers and wrapped him in every blanket he owned, sitting him as close to the fire as he dared. Boro, sensing the man's desperation, stopped barking and began licking his frozen hands. "My Lena," Hemlock whispered, his eyes wild with fear. "She went for help. To the Sterlings. Their house is bigger, stronger." Before Elias could respond, there was another series of desperate thumps at the door. He opened it to find Lena, supporting Mrs. Gable, both of them near collapse. Behind them, two more figures emerged from the blinding whiteout. It was Mr. Sterling and his wife, their fine wool coats offering little protection against the storm's elemental rage. "Our chimney collapsed," Sterling said, his voice stripped of its usual authority, replaced by sheer, ragged terror. "The house is filling with smoke, and the cold. God, the cold." One by one, they stumbled into the small, warm space. Elias's cabin, the valley's folly, had become a refuge. He said nothing of their mockery, their disbelief. He simply made room for them, handing out cups of hot water, sharing his small store of bread and dried meat. There were 9 of them in total by midday, the entire population of the Upper Valley, crammed into the 16 by 20-foot room. They huddled together, a small island of humanity against the roaring storm, their earlier certainties stripped away, leaving only the basic, desperate need for warmth. They watched him as he moved about the small space, his actions calm and deliberate. He added a single log to the fire, checked the temperature, and climbed the ladder to the 3rd tier. Mr. Sterling watched him, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "What is he doing?" he muttered to Hemlock. Hemlock, his color slowly returning, just shook his head. "I don't know, but this place, it's impossible." Elias returned with the thermometer from the attic. He held it out. The mercury read 76 degrees. Then he held up the thermometer from the living space, 63 degrees. He pointed a thumb towards the floor. "Cellar's 35, perfect for the food." He looked at the faces staring back at him, pale in the firelight. "The heat stays where you put it." The simple statement hung in the air, heavier than any argument he could have made. In the warmth of the impossible house, surrounded by the blizzard that had destroyed their own sensible homes, they finally understood. They had been trying to fight the winter. Elias had learned to dance with it. For another day and a half, the blizzard raged. The small cabin was cramped and smelled of wet wool and fear. But it was alive. It was warm. Mr. Sterling, the man of wealth and power, sat on the floor next to Hemlock, the man of hard-earned experience, both of them humbled. Lena helped Elias distribute the food, her eyes meeting his over the heads of the others, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He had not just built a house, he had built an ark. When the wind finally died down and the snow stopped, the silence was as profound as the storm's noise had been. The world outside was unrecognizable, a landscape of immense, rolling white dunes. The snow was piled 15 feet deep in places, burying entire homes, leaving only the hint of a roofline to show where they had been. Elias's cabin stood tall, the top 2 tiers rising from the snowpack like a mountain peak. Smoke curled from its chimney, a defiant signal of life in the white wasteland. It took them a week to dig their way out, to begin the slow, arduous process of assessing the damage. The valley was devastated, Roofs were gone, walls collapsed, livestock lost. Many would have perished if not for the shelter of Elias's folly. The work of rebuilding began, but this time it was different. Mr. Sterling was the first to approach him, his hat in his hand. "Elias," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its old arrogance. "I was a fool. I would be honored if you would show me the plans. Your grandfather's journal. We need to rebuild, and we need to rebuild it right." Hemlock was next. He didn't say much. He just walked up to Elias, put a heavy hand on his shoulder, and looked him in the eye. "The seams held," he said. It was both an apology and the highest compliment he could give. In the months and years that followed, the valley was transformed. The old, low-slung cabins were replaced, one by one, with three-tiered houses built on deep stone foundations. Elias, the quiet boy everyone had pitied, became the most respected man in the community. He never lorded his knowledge over them. He simply shared the journal, teaching the men how to scribe the logs, how to build the central chimney, how to construct the heat trap attic. He taught them his grandfather's wisdom, and in doing so, he made the entire valley stronger, safer. He and Lena married the following spring. They expanded the cabin, adding a wing built to the same principles, their home becoming the heart of the renewed community. The children they had grew up playing in the warm, secure house, their winters a thing of comfort, not of fear. The 100-year blizzard passed into legend, a story told to frighten children, but also a story of rescue, a story about the quiet boy who listened to the wisdom of the past. Time flowed on, as relentless and steady as the river in the valley. Boro grew old, his muzzle white, his steps slow. He spent his final years sleeping by the hearth, the same hearth that had warmed him through the great storm. One autumn morning, he did not wake up. Elias carried his old friend to a spot on the hill overlooking the cabin, a place where the morning sun would always touch, and buried him. He carved a simple stone marker, Boro. He was a good dog. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the cold stone, the silence filled with the weight of years. Decades passed. Elias's hair turned the color of snow. His hands, though gnarled with age, could still read the grain of a piece of wood. He was a grandfather himself now, his grandchildren living in tiered houses of their own. He taught them what his grandfather had taught him, passing the knowledge forward, ensuring it would not be lost again. The journal, its pages now as soft as cloth, was his most treasured possession. Lena passed peacefully in her sleep one winter, the cabin she had helped build holding her in its warmth to the very end. Elias lived on for 5 more years, a quiet, revered patriarch. He saw the valley thrive, secure against the harshest winters, a community built on a foundation of shared wisdom. He knew his work was done. His own end came on a quiet summer evening. He sat on the porch of his cabin, the original structure still standing as strong and true as the day he finished it. He looked out at the valley, at the smoke rising from a dozen tall chimneys, and he smiled. He closed his eyes, and he did not open them again. They buried him on the hill next to Lena and Boro, overlooking the house that had changed everything. Mr. Sterling's grandson, now the community elder, carved his epitaph into a large piece of granite. It was simple, just a few words that captured the essence of his life. It didn't mention the storm or the houses he had inspired. It just said, Elias.
He had a good plan.
From the hill, the original cabin stood against the sky. It was no longer a folly, it was a monument, a testament to the enduring power of quiet persistence, of unconventional wisdom, and of a home built not just to withstand the winter, but to embrace it. It stood solid, its 3 tiers a permanent feature of the landscape, a silent story for all who saw it. It held. It would always hold.